Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anita Dindana, and I am the chair of the trustees for the South Orange Maplewood Community Coalition on Race. I'm also a mom to a 5-year-old who is going to be entering the school district next year, and also an 11-year-old who is currently at South Orange Middle School. So I'm personally looking forward to tonight, along with all of you. And we're so glad that you can join us tonight, especially the many young families and new residents of South Orange and Maplewood. Welcome. I know personally that getting out of the house on a weeknight is no small feat. So, your presence here really is meaningful and says something very important. It says that you care deeply about this community and about the future that we're building together. So, for those of you who are new to the coalition, let me just take a moment to introduce who we are and why we're here. The Community Coalition on Race was founded more than 25 years ago with a bold and intentional vision to build and sustain a community that is racially, culturally, and socially integrated and truly inclusive, where there is equity and equality for all. As a part of that mission, the coalition has been, since its inception, committed to achieving fully integrated and equitable public schools. And at the heart of it all is the truth that every child, every young person, every family could and should feel a deep sense of belonging in our towns and in our schools. The coalition is an independent nonprofit organization, but one that works in close partnership with our towns, with our school district, with our interfaith clergy coalition, and with many community partners and elected officials. Together, we are committed to sustaining the work of intentional integration, work that doesn't happen by accident, but that happens through ongoing commitment, collaboration, partnership, and advocacy. We welcome and have invited all of our partners and community members tonight to tonight's event, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge the many leaders who are here and thank you all. We have from our school district, we have our superintendent Jason Bing, our assistant superintendent Ann Bodner, Zoila Correa, Carrie Wabel. We also have elected school board representatives here tonight, Shayna Sackett-Gable, Paul Steffen, Malini Nair, Liz Callahan, Deirdre Brown, Regina Eckert, and Bimal Kapadia. Thank you so much. And we have from our town leadership, Bill Haskins from South Orange. And I don't know if I'm missing folks, but if I missed you, please forgive us. And we will acknowledge you later in this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge that we have in our audience former Assemblywoman Myla Jasey. Thank you, Myla, for your partnership and consistency in standing by us in this vital work for so many years. The coalition does not shy away from hard conversations because integration, equity, and inclusion require us to be honest, reflective, and sometimes uncomfortable. These conversations can be messy, painful, and imperfect, but they are absolutely necessary. As you'll hear tonight, our community has been striving and struggling for over 4 decades to push forward a vision of integrated and equitable schools. The journey has not been easy, but it has been courageous, and it has shaped the character of our towns. The idea for tonight's event, now more than ever, was inspired by the leadership of our beloved former trustee, Carol Berry Austin, and has grown now into this event through conversations we've had with some of our youngest parent volunteers on the Coalition School Committee, as well as the hard work of our schools committee volunteers themselves, with the leadership of Elizabeth, Christina, Jocelyn, Erin, and Michelle. Thank you all so much, Schools Committee, for putting this event together. We know that many move here because our town's history of integration and because of our reputation for being a place that values it. But we've also heard from parents that they realize that they don't fully know that history. what brought us here, what challenges we faced, or what led our community just 7 years ago to commit to a district-wide plan for intentional school integration. Tonight, we really want to share that decades-long history with you all, honestly and transparently. You'll hear from experts in the field of educational integration from our esteemed panel. You'll also hear from alumni from our school district who will share lived experiences of what it's like to learn in environments that were not always diverse, inclusive, or culturally responsive. These are important messages and stories for us to hear important voices. Our hope is that you'll find this evening informative and thought-provoking and inspiring, but also that you'll allow yourself to be uncomfortable when the truth requires it. Some of what you may hear may be unsettling, and you may not agree with every perspective shared tonight, and that is okay, it's part of the work. Our job as a community is not to erase or avoid our history, but to confront it, to learn from it, and to build on it with courage and humility. So I ask all of us to approach tonight's discussion with open minds, with grace, and with curiosity. If you hear something that challenges you, lean in, ask questions, engage with your neighbors, continue the conversation after tonight, because it is through deep dialogue and reflection that we can move forward together. So once again, thank you for being here, for caring, and for continuing this work now more than ever. If you would like to be more involved or to support the coalition, please see the table, and there is some information in the back where you came in and registered, and we would love for you to sign up to volunteer or to donate to continue to support this important work. So now it is my honor to introduce our moderator for the evening, a fellow coalition trustee, a lifelong educator, a caring parent, Norman Francis, who will help guide us through this important conversation. Thank you so much.
Hey, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here as a member of the Community Coalition on Race, and 20-plus resident here in town, and a lifelong public educator. It's definitely a topic that I find very, very important, and at this time in our community, definitely need to take time to make sure that everyone is aware of everything that's happened, that's brought us to this point. Being an educator, I love learning, and I find myself learning more and more, even though I've been here for 20 years, and learning more about what's happened in terms of the history, and even more so the perspective of the people that you have conversations with as you move through the community, new people coming in. So I'm so happy that we have this opportunity for this refresher, and also to look forward to where we're going. And at this time, we'll have our director, Ms. Nancy Garnier, begin with our presentation.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I am Nancy Garnier, the Executive Director of the Community Coalition on Race. I know Anita gave you a little bit of background, but I'm going to repeat a few things, not repeat, but extend. The coalition was established in 1997 as an intentional racial integration organization to address concerns about stagnant housing values, changing demographics, school integration, and educational equity issues, all with the aspiration of being a truly inclusive and integrated community. And behind our 3 decades of work is the concept that residential integration supports school integration and vice versa. And that is a big part of why we're here tonight. Fully realized school integration supports our vision of a stably integrated and equitable community. So to start us off, I'm going to give some background on the district and the community, how we've tried to desegregate our schools over the years, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, and how the community, the district, and the 2 towns have moved along in their acceptance and support of school integration, integrated schools. And when I say we, I mean this is decades of individuals pop-up groups, formal groups. There is no one group responsible for any particular movement, but a lot of work and a lot of effort has been done by many, many people over many, many years. So we've gathered a lot of information for you, and some of the slides are too detailed to go into in the time we have, but they'll be available later on our website. I want to draw your attention to some key integration, key points in our integration journey. We begin to see some real integration efforts, like the pairing of Marshall and Jefferson schools in 1982, a time when the town's black population represented 4% in Maplewood and 10% in South Orange. At the time, the pairing was vehemently opposed, but then there's a change, and it is passionately defended over the decades. So what people had issues with, they ended up supporting. And by the mid-1990s, the demographic changes are dramatic, reaching 33% and 31% who identified as Black by the 2000 census. And there are multiple attempts during the 90s to redraw attendance zones to achieve racial balance in the elementary schools. And there were very bitter disputes about this. As someone who moved here in '97, I can attest to those disputes. I was told not to raise certain issues with certain neighbors, so many of us who've been around for a long time remember what that was like. A new superintendent arrived in 1998 and worked with the community to create something more stable than redrawing attendance zones. That resulted in making Seth Boyden a demonstration school. These elementary school reconfigurations improved, but did not fully achieve elementary school integration. Plus, we were still struggling with a serious racial achievement gap, Black students being disproportionately assigned to lower level classes, as well as experiencing disproportionate school disciplinary actions in the middle and high schools. The Access and Equity Policy that's adopted in 2015 is one step toward alleviating these disparities. By 2018, under the direction of Interim Superintendent Vergara, the school district gains a long-range facilities plan that promises to support fully integrated elementary schools. If you've lived here long enough, you've heard some version of these conversations over and over again. Many of the concerns: children must be coming from out of district illegally, some quote-unquote neighborhood schools are better than other schools, our property values are at risk if the school demographics change. All of these are reasons that the Community Coalition exists and the Schools Committee does the work that it does. To address these concerns for current and future residents of all racial backgrounds, this is some of the work that the Coalition has engaged in our almost 30-year history to help move the community, the towns, and the district toward embracing integration. We've pushed the district to hire more teachers of color. Our demographic studies have been used to inform district plans regarding integration. We've pushed the district to address the opportunity gap and to reduce levels or academic tracking. We have had nationally regarded integration experts come and speak to our community and provide anti-racism training, which is really critical, to community members and teachers, among other advocacy efforts, which you can check out on our website. Not only is it our moral obligation to desegregate, it's also a legal obligation. Our state remains the only state in the country with a constitutional ban on school segregation. And there is a case currently with the New Jersey Appellate Court seeking to explicitly ban de facto segregation, which is segregation that is caused by factors such as housing patterns, which is the case here in New Jersey, where school placement has been so closely tied to neighborhood. There have also been lawsuits primarily with regard to academic tracking and inequitable disciplinary practices. Part of the school district's current settlement agreement with the Black Parents Workshop includes a requirement to integrate the schools. So this is where we've been. We were ordered by the State Education Commissioner in 1980 to end racial imbalance, and the Marshall-Jefferson pairing was proposed. This is what our district looked like at the time: 88% white, 12% children of color. Marshall, meanwhile, was 71% white, and Jefferson was 98% white. Amid community uproar, the pairing went ahead. So we see the changes and we see the success of this pairing. In the 90s, the sending zone to South Mountain was changed in order to add more students of lower socioeconomic status. 21 years later, the needle hadn't actually moved much for South Mountain. Seth Boyden became a demonstration school in 1999, and for a time, students of all races were opting in from across the district. But those numbers dwindled over the years. You can see from 1998, 2009, and 2019, those changes. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the Intentional Integration Initiative. In 2018, the Board of Education and governments of both towns committed to an integration plan, and the Intentional Integration Initiative was finally adopted by a unanimous vote by the board in 2020 based on these community and district precepts. And this is how it works. The triple I is a proximity algorithm. This means that students will attend the closest school that has space at their socioeconomic tier. Ideally, every school would have roughly 30% low SES, 30% medium, and 40% high SES students to mirror the district. But before the algorithm can be applied to incoming students, incoming children are assigned to the school, their older siblings attend, and special education students and multilingual learners are placed in the school that best fits their needs. Only then is the algorithm applied. Right now, school capacity is the main reason children are not assigned to their closest school. The next few slides, which you can take time to read later, show the before and after of the triple I in terms of both SES tier required by the algorithm and how that has adjusted racial balance. In summary, it did exactly what it was intended to do. Our elementary schools reflect the socioeconomic and racial makeup of our district much more closely than they did prior to triple I. A lot of detail, but you can look at that later. I want to spend just a few minutes debunking some of the myths surrounding the integration plan that you may have heard online or from neighbors. A lot of these myths have been floating around for many years, even prior to this plan. Before the triple I, attendance zones had been redrawn so many times that many children weren't going to their closest school. The Marshall-Jefferson pairing and the Seth Boyden opt-in program took many children across town. And overcrowding meant that many children were shut out of their closest school. By 2020, according to the superintendent at that time, 35% of children in district were not attending their zoned school. And this is what zoning looks like before the triple I. Another myth is that transportation for the triple I is the sole or even the primary cause of our current budget deficit, and we consider that to be false. Our transportation spend last year was $10.5 million. Of that, the estimate for pre-K general education is $1.2 million. Pre-K is not currently part of the triple I. The K through 12 gen ed estimate is $3.3 million, and we don't have yet a current estimate for K through 5 or K through 8, but we know it's less than that, and eliminating it all will not solve our budget deficit. The last myth I want to debunk is that we don't need an integration plan because our towns are already integrated, and I, of course, wish that were true. We are fairly diverse, more so than many other parts of the state and country, but we have witnessed a decline in Black in-movers to SOMA, which puts our racial diversity at risk, and many of our neighborhoods are not integrated. People like to say they moved here for the diversity, but living here isn't enough. Our integration requires intentionality. And desegregation isn't enough either. It's just the first step. We also need to make sure that every child and family feels that they belong in their school. We need to enroll more students of color and low-income students to our preschool program and get to our universal number. Transportation, we know, is an issue and needs to be solved. So has inequitable discipline issues. And most importantly, we need to end the opportunity gap that has persisted in this district for too many years. And now our next speaker will share her personal and professional perspective on these very issues. Raised in Soma, a student in the Marshall Jefferson pairing, a former teacher at Seth Boyden, and now a Montclair parent and mentor to newly graduated teachers at Montclair State University. I would like to welcome Rena Jasey-Goodman.
Okay, thank you so much, Nancy. Fun fact, I taught Nancy's daughter at Seth Boyden years ago, Charlotte. So I'm so happy to be here. As Nancy said, my name is Rena Jasey-Goodman. I grew up in South Orange. I am so excited to be back at Columbia High School. I don't know when the last time I was here, but you'll hear more about my experiences. But I was asked to share my reflections on integration from 3 different perspectives. From the perspective of a student, as I said, I attended Marshall from 1984 to 1987. And then I attended Jefferson Elementary School, South Orange Middle School, and Columbia High School. I graduated in 1997. I also am here to share my perspective as a teacher. I taught at Seth Boyden. I actually started subbing there in 2001 after I graduated college and didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. But then I went back to school, got certified, and actually taught at Seth Boyden from 2003 to 2009. I did a bunch of other stuff in education, and then moved back to New Jersey and now work at Montclair State, and I have 2 daughters in the public schools in Montclair, so I'm also going to share my parent perspective. So, when we're having these challenging conversations, it can be helpful to see the issues from various viewpoints, so I'm hoping that sharing some of my experiences will provide you with a glimpse into some other perspectives. I do also want to note that some of the issues I'm going to describe are no longer present due to the great work that has been done over the last 40 years, but I'm still sharing them because they are my experiences and they sort of shape the history, so just that caveat. So I'm going to start back in 1981 when I was just 2 years old, and my older brother was entering kindergarten at Marshall School, and at that time, that's when the district decided to pair Marshall and Jefferson, as you heard. And my mother talks about going to different meetings, and specifically, she talked about going to a meeting in the Jefferson School Auditorium, and I know it's now Bolden, but I'll be calling it Jefferson for this, because I'm talking historically. So she was in the Jefferson auditorium, and Jefferson parents were standing up saying, I don't want my kid to go to that school in that part of town with those kids. And my mom stood up and said, hey, you're talking about my kid, like what's going on? And so there was a lot of tension. We know families that pulled their kids out at that time and sent them to private school rather than send them across town to Marshall Elementary School. We also know that some of those same parents chose to send their younger siblings to Marshall and Jefferson because they saw how great it was working out. So as Nancy said, the feelings around it changed. But there was definitely a lot of tension and animosity in the town. But when I happily entered kindergarten in 1984, I was totally oblivious to all of that. I was just excited to be able to walk to my neighborhood school with my best friend who lived on my street, and then take the bus with her to Maplewood. We thought it was so cool that we had friends in Maplewood and we lived in South Orange. That was like a really cool thing. That was a big deal. I'm looking at Maggie because she was in Maplewood, I was in South Orange. We've been friends since kindergarten because of that. And so it was just really exciting. It was a little hard when we were separated for middle school because the kids who lived in South Orange went to South Orange Middle School, the kids who lived in Maplewood went to Maplewood Middle School, but we made new friends, and then when we got back to high school, we got back together again, and we had that many more connections, and it just made the freshman experience that much less intimidating because we knew so many people from all across the 2 towns. So while the parents were upset, the kids were actually fine, right? And I had an excellent education. I had diverse teachers. I loved growing up here. That doesn't mean that there were not challenges along the way. So I'm going to share just a couple. My mom talks about how my older brother was not recommended for testing for the gifted program at Jefferson School, even though he had very high grades. And when she saw that all these other kids that were being put in the gifted program, they were mostly white, she questioned the teacher. The teacher said, "Oh, Neil, he's such a nice, quiet boy." And she was like, "Yeah, but he can do the work." And so she had to push to let him have the opportunity to be tested to get into the gifted program. I know the gifted program doesn't exist in that way anymore, but that's just an example of some of the biases that were at play, right? Because he was quiet, he was able to go under the radar as a black boy. And then in middle school, once our classes became leveled, as you heard, there were more black students in the lower levels in middle school, once I got to middle school. However, most of the black students that I started kindergarten with in Marshall School were actually in the honors classes. So that was just an interesting sort of perspective that I had from that time. And then I want to share another example from middle school, which is an example of the challenge of impact versus intent, right? This idea of trying to do something right, but it not going well. So this is the 90s. So we were all about multiculturalism back in the 90s, right? And so there was this initiative, I cannot remember the acronym, but it was like celebrating diversity, right? And so we had advisories, and we were instructed to create a depiction of diversity that was gonna go on this big board and be hung in the cafeteria at South Orange Middle School. And so my advisor, our teacher, she decided that we were all gonna create flags that represented our culture. Okay, and so I made an American flag because I'm American, and she didn't like that. She told me that because I was African American, I needed to pick a country in Africa and make a flag from that, and preferably West Africa because that's where most of the slaves came from. So I was a very quiet 13-year-old. I was a compliant kid. I did what teachers told me to do. And so it was very hard for me to push back against this, but I did. And I'm sure my mom helped a little bit. But I ended up having my American flag because, I was like, culturally, I am African American, and the American flag represents that culture for me. And so, I don't think her intent was to cause trauma to a middle school student, but that very much was the impact, right? And so when we're thinking about intentional integration, I think we need to be very careful about impact versus intent. And make sure that the impact of what we're doing is aligned to what we're intending, because otherwise we can cause harm without even realizing it. So then I got to high school and I loved it. I'm not going to say much about high school, except that it was great. I loved it. I took art. I was captain of the soccer team. I did varsity volleyball. I was in the yearbook. I painted scenery for the plays. Like, being here is like really cool because I remember being up on the stage. It was an amazing experience, and I think what stands out to me the most is that I really felt like there was a place for everyone here. Like, everybody had the opportunity to find their group, find their crew, and that really stuck out to me. And one person in particular I want to mention is Mrs. Peniston. She was our guidance counselor. She was African American, and she was just such an advocate for all students, and especially for all black students. We knew she had our back. She was effective. She had high expectations for us, and she pushed us to excel. And that I'm pointing her out specifically because it's important for every kid, especially every child of color, to have an advocate for them in the school building. Preferably somebody with a little power, but it's really important for them to have that advocate that they can go to when something off happens, right? Like that diversity thing that happened in middle school. And so I didn't quite realize how unique, and I'm on the wrong, I forgot to forward this to my pictures. Sorry, I forgot. After I made my mom bring that photo albums over last night, so I could find the pictures. So this is, on the left-hand side, this is Mr. Krause. Anybody remember Mr. Krause from Marshall School? He was our principal. I don't even know what I was doing in this picture, but that's me on the stage. And then on the right is the Jefferson Auditorium. It says, "Love can build a bridge." This is actually my brother's class picture, but you can't really tell. And then those are all the phases of my hair over the 20 years. But I didn't realize how unique and awesome my experience had been growing up in this community until I got to college. And I went to Harvard, and our freshman RAs were a gay couple, and there were a few gay students in our entryway, and it wasn't a big deal to me, right? We had gay students in the hallways at Columbia High School, some of them having a little too much PDA, right? But we were used to that. It wasn't a problem. It was just normal behavior for teenagers to engage in, right? We had interracial couples in our high school. The most popular white male student was dating a black girl. The most popular black male student was dating a white girl. It all was normal for us. We had transgender students that we graduated with. And so when I encountered those people like that, or people in similar relationships, it was just normal to me. And my peers were shocked. They were like, what is happening? They were uncomfortable. And I didn't realize, I'm like, doesn't everybody have this experience in high school? And the answer is no, not at all. I have a friend who tells a story about how when she was in college, she had pictures of her friends, and they were just fascinated that she had black friends and Jewish friends, and they just couldn't believe that she had so many different types of friends. And some of them had never even met a Jewish person before. And so I don't take for granted the value of having real, authentic relationships with people who are different from me, starting at a very young age. And I just really appreciate that bubble that I grew up in. And so just to say that my experiences as a student made me realize the importance of access, the importance of high expectations, the importance of checking and challenging our own biases, and the importance of having an advocate for kids. So fast forward to teaching at Seth Boyden. So I was one of the few subs that would actually go to Seth Boyden, apparently. And so I was assigned there all the time. And I quickly fell in love with it. Marilyn Davenport was the assistant superintendent, I believe was her title at the time. And she's the one who brought multiple intelligences to the district. And she just had this amazing way of speaking to children. She was so kind and so gentle and so patient. And the students just responded to her approach in a way that I'd never seen anything like it. And she inspired me to go back and get my certification and then return to Seth Boyden and teach. And so I want to tell you a little bit about the demonstration school and how it worked. So there were about 100 spots that were opened up to anybody in the district outside of the neighborhood to choose to send their student to Seth Boyden. And those students were bused in because they were further than a mile away, most of them. Many of those students were white. And so you can imagine the optics of sort of the white kids getting off the bus. But not all were white. There were some affluent black families who chose to send their kids to this school. And I would say there were also a couple of families who were kind of counseled out of their traditional schools and sort of strongly encouraged to move their children to Seth Boyden because our approach would be a better fit for their kids. And that's because we had a very child-centered approach. We took multiple intelligences very seriously. We considered how is everybody smart, not if they are smart. We embraced the whole child. We met them where they were. We acted out math problems. We had a lot of freedom with curriculum, so we could design curriculum that was really engaging to students. So if you look in the top left-hand corner, these are some of my 5th graders, and what they're doing is they're making working models of roller coasters using foam pipe insulation tubing and marbles and cardboard in order to demonstrate their understanding of physics. And every single child participated and was able to explain all the physics concepts at play in that working model, right? And so that's just one way that we really made curriculum and learning come alive. We also were able to have real conversations about race and family. And so I want to point out the picture on the right. I don't know if you can see the woman in the green sweater is my grandmother. She's still alive today, she's 101. She came and talked to the students about growing up in the Jim Crow South and attending segregated schools. And they were able to just ask her really honest questions and just having that opportunity to learn from somebody who lived that history. And these same kids would turn and ask me when we were learning about Ruby Bridges, wait, would you have been in the white school or the black school? And we could have an open and honest conversation about that. And I really believe that those discussions and those opportunities for authentic discussion can shape students' understanding of the world in a way that's unique to having the integrated experience like we had here. I also want to highlight that we engaged in non-punitive measures for addressing issues with our students. So one example is that I like to have non-negotiables about certain things and flexibility around the edges. So I will tell this story about a parent conference that I had with a parent of a black boy in 3rd grade, very smart, very sweet kid, and I'm telling her how great he's doing, he's so smart, he's doing so well, this is his work, right? And she interrupts me and she says, how do you get him to sit? And I was like, oh, he doesn't sit. Like, he doesn't sit. That's not a requirement. Like, I don't really care if he sits. Like, he will come and say, I can't sit in my chair. That's fine. You have the option of a lap desk. You can get a clipboard and stand in the back of the room as long as you're not blocking anybody, as long as you're not bothering anyone else. You're going to do your work. Where you do it, it doesn't matter to me. So she couldn't believe it because all the feedback she had gotten was, he won't sit, he won't sit, he won't sit, he won't sit, right? So when we think about being intentional with creating learning opportunities and spaces for all children to have a sense of belonging, we really need to think about how we can have non-punitive measures, how we can have, we call it, in the work I do, it's anti-racist behavior management strategies. Cultural responsiveness, we need to provide opportunities for kids to have windows and mirrors. So what does that mean? That means as a kid I should see myself reflected as a mirror in the curriculum and content and materials, and I should also see a window into the experiences of others in the curricular opportunities and experiences I'm having in my classroom, right? So those are some of the ways we can be intentional about integration efforts and not just sort of put kids together in one room and hope for the best. So we did have some challenges. So in our school, we had kids who were coming from $1 million homes, and we had kids who were living in homes that literally had no furniture in them. And so we were very purposeful about equity and access to opportunities and working to bridge resource gaps wherever possible. So some specific ways we did that: we never sent projects home. Any homework that we sent was something they could do independently, and if they weren't able to do it, they were not penalized for not doing it. The Invention Convention is an excellent example. The Invention Convention, my understanding of the Invention Convention in other schools in the district was like this huge thing. It was in the gym or the cafeteria, everyone was invited. Kids, i.e. parents, went all out, right? And so we didn't do it that way at Seth Boyden. At Seth Boyden, it was all done in class. So they would plan it, they would prepare it, they would prep for it. They would then, after they had a solid plan, the kids who could would finish it at home. The other kids would come after school with parent volunteers, use the materials that were purchased by the PTA, they could choose what they wanted, and they could create something that they were really proud of. And in that way, the Invention Convention was a display of what our kids could do. And it was equitable. Every kid had an invention that looked similar. That's a picture in the middle of our Invention Convention. And we just did it in our classroom. It wasn't like a big show because it was about the process, not the show, right, at the end. And so that was just an example of how we help bridge that gap for our families. The other thing that we need to do with intentionally integrating is identifying inequities and taking action to address those when we see them. And so one example of that is the gifted program at Seth Boyden at the time. Seth Boyden was about 70% black, I would say, at the time, and our gifted program was almost all white. And it started in 4th grade, I taught 3rd grade, remember. And so I was like, what is happening? I have so many smart black students. This is not acceptable. I need to understand. How do you identify students for the gifted program? Oh, we use objective measures, right? Okay, great, what are they? They have to have a 250 on the NJS. So if they did 249, they're not in. 248, not good enough. They had to have a 250 on the NJS. And we looked at their grades. They had to have a certain grade average. But they didn't look at the June grades. They looked at the April grades. How are we supposed to know that? The 3rd grade teachers didn't know that. So I went to the 3rd grade teachers and I was like, if you think you're gonna give so-and-so a 4 in June, give them a 4 in April so they can have a better chance to pass these objective measures, right? It was ridiculous. So that's an example of just these barriers being placed and preventing opportunity. And so we ended up creating a whole after-school program, wrote a grant, got it funded so that all kids could have the support they needed to get over that hump of 250 to get into the gifted program so it was more diverse. I know the program doesn't exist in that way anymore, but that's just an example of seeing an inequity and taking action to address it. So intentional integration is hard, messy, and progress is not always linear, like we've seen. Like I said, students need to have windows and mirrors. They need to have the sense of belonging. We need to respond to inequities. We need to purposely address potential barriers and resource gaps. And in order to do this, school leaders and teachers need the training, support, and resources to engage in intentional integration activities. Because these things are not taught in most teacher preparation programs. And especially they weren't taught 10 or 15 years ago when a lot of our teachers went through school. And so we need to be really deliberate about this. Anti-racist behavior management strategies, how to identify inequities in schools, considering impact versus intent, and also providing parents with opportunities to learn about how they can help. You're all here learning about this, so that's great. But they really need the support. We can't just expect teachers to know what to do. We need to give them the resources and support so that they can be as successful as possible. So, brings me to the present day. I have 2 daughters. Amelia is 6 and in kindergarten, and Julia is 8 and in 3rd grade. And when my husband and I were looking for a house, I told him, okay, we can live in South Orange, Maplewood, or Montclair. He was like, what about Connecticut? I was like, South Orange, Maplewood, or Montclair. So we ended up in Montclair, about a mile from my older brother. And you know, I wanted to live in one of those 3 towns because of the way integration and diversity shaped my understanding of the world. And now I wasn't sure about this whole not going to neighborhood schools thing. I was very skeptical of this whole magnet program they have in Montclair. That's how Montclair addressed the segregation issues years ago. And it's just to give you a brief overview of how it works. Each elementary school in Montclair has a magnet theme, so things like STEM, gifted and talented, environmental science, global studies. So all parents then rate the schools by preference, considering the magnet, the location, and the start time. There's 3 different start times, so start time plays a big role, as many working parents know. And then the algorithm considers your ranking as part of the placement process, and then it spits out, you know, where you're going to go. So to decide on the rankings, parents actually get to tour the schools when their kids are in preschool. And I think this is really helpful because it helps demonstrate to the parents that all the schools are great. And so you really can't go wrong. And you do learn what makes each school unique, but they're all strong schools. We ranked CHB, which stands for Charles H. Bullock, as number 1 because it reminded me of Seth Boyden. I walked in and I was like, this feels like home. So that's why we ranked it number 1, even though it's the 2nd furthest from our house. And so my daughters don't have friends on the block that go to their school. In fact, all the kids on the block go to all different schools. And it's great because they have their block friends, and then they have their school friends, and then at their block friends' birthday parties, they meet kids from other schools, and it's like, oh, I was in ballet with you, oh, I played soccer with you. And so they're getting more networks of friendships and relationships across the whole town. Also, it turns out 1 block over, there's 5 kids in 3rd grade at CHB that Julia's friends with. So we did have friends in the neighborhood, we just didn't know who they were until she went there. And so, you know, so that's been like a really great experience for us. But I do want to sort of acknowledge that I appreciate the role that ranking has on our feelings about the overall process. Not all people get their first or second or third choice, but as a parent, you do feel like at least I had some say, right? So I do appreciate that, and I want to name that, but I also want to note that while we're happy with the schools, they are not perfect. All the schools are diverse, but every school has different percentages of race and ethnicity. They do not have nearly the same balances of race that you have here in South Orange, Maplewood. There are schools with very, very few Black students. They have Indian students, they have Asian students, they have Latino students, and then there are schools with a lot more Black students. And so, you know, this element of choice I have seen does make an impact on the actual racial makeup of the school. So there are trade-offs, right? I don't think there's any perfect method here, but I just wanted to share that as another sort of lens that there's trade-offs. Now I want to also talk about what has helped make integration successful at CHB. So At CHB, from the parent perspective, we have very intentional communities formed at our school. The families feel connected. Everyone has their magnet on their car and the gear, and they volunteer, and they go to the events and the fundraisers, right? I'm on Barrett, which is the Bullock Anti-Racist Equity Team, and so we really work on providing windows and mirrors for our students and communicating making sure the families are communicating with the school. We do an equity survey of the parents, like how do you feel like your kids are being treated in the school. We have a lot of open and honest conversations. We also have a sense of shared responsibility among the parents, so the community takes care of each other. We have a SNAP food drive when that went away. We do Thanksgiving meals. We do holiday gifts for CHB students. We do after-school enrichment scholarships so every kid can go. We have, parents are very generous with their time and or their money, and I will say, at least in my experience, the wealthier parents seem willing to give more so that everyone can have what they need. I haven't experienced parents saying, well, what about my kid? What's my kid gonna get out of this? And so there is this shared responsibility that really helps the integration be intentional. And so just to close, I wanna just pose this question. Considering the student experience, the teacher experience, and the parent experience, how are we all being intentional about integration in our schools, right? What are we doing? What can we do? What opportunities exist for the district to consider what students, teachers, and parents value, what they need, and what their responsibilities are moving forward? Integration is not just putting kids from all over the two towns in the same classroom. Intentional integration means that schools and leaders and teachers and parents all must be deliberate about how they approach it. So what are you doing proactively to make this work and to benefit all students? We need to continue to have intentional conversations around race like we are today, identify and reflect on our own biases, and parents and students need to be part of the work. I encourage us to give each other grace and hold each other accountable. And I want to leave you with this quote from Ruby Bridges, because Ruby Bridges Day is on Friday. I know some of you guys celebrate that. We're celebrating it for the first time at CHB this week. We're very excited. The first steps toward change are never easy. Keep your eyes on the prize, and at all costs, stay united. Thank you.
As we seek to answer many questions from young families about why our community committed to district-wide integration 7 years ago and why we need to stay the course, we want to share with you some voices of Columbia High School grads who were in elementary in the mid-2000s and early 2010s prior to the district-wide integration. Our Columbia High School students' voices are incredibly impactful. They care deeply about our community and our world, and as you will hear, they are fearless about speaking up for one another and sharing uncomfortable truths. While some of the specific curricular structures or programs that they describe may have since ended and been modified as part of the district's integration and equity work, these students' experiences are a critical piece of our collective history that must inform our work today. These experiences underscore the deep legacies we are grappling with and the gravitational pull towards segregation that we as a community must actively and deliberately counter.
I started at Jefferson 3rd grade and I came around like October, November. I moved from like inner city area, like East Orange, Newark area. I literally lived on the other end of Maplewood. I didn't live close to Jefferson at all. I had to take a bus there. It was pretty diverse, but I think it's because of that school bus.
I was supposed to be zoned for Tuscan, but we had the choice to choose between Tuscan and Seth Boyden. And my parents visited both schools and thought that Seth Boyden was more diverse and offered more opportunities. So they chose Seth Boyden compared to Tuscan.
Everybody was open because everybody was so young. So like everybody was open to be friends with anybody. It didn't matter who you were or anything. Everybody was open at that time. Once you start growing up more and more, everybody's not that open, especially if you're coming from another town or another place.
I guess I was fortunate enough to have teachers that that taught us to respect different cultures. I can vividly remember, I forget what grade it was, but we had a day where everybody brought in a meal, like a homemade meal from, from their culture. It was like, oh, so we were just being naturally taught to be accepting of other people's cultures.
The classes themselves, especially at the elementary school level, were certainly integrated, but there were aspects that were less so. So, for example, there were like enrichment programs where students were pulled from class. Certain students were pulled from class to attend those enrichment programs at that time, and other students who stayed in the classroom, in the regular classroom, and did other activities during that period. There were more white students who were attending those enrichment programs and other students who were not.
A certain like an elitist like feel to it if you were in an enrichment program because that reflected that you're more like academically stronger, at least in my perspective, than the other students.
For 1 to 2 months, I was placed in special ed. And there was a period where I wasn't sociable. They came to their own conclusion, so to speak, that maybe I was, probably not picking up the material as quickly as other students. And then I'm in that class and I'm having to like, they realize, oh, wow, she can read, she can write, she can socialize. Okay, so maybe she was just nervous. Instead of actually testing my abilities, or giving me a chance to do so. So I do think that assumptions were made and that can be a fault.
The kids who were in the extracurriculars I was doing were largely the white students from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. You saw less of the students of color, of the Black students, the brown students, and the students whose parents may not have had as many economic resources or just resources to have them stay later, pick them up later on a random day of the week in order to go to play practice.
I didn't need to have an after school program before because my mom just stayed home. But then she got a job, and so that's why we had to do an after school program. And I felt like, I don't know. And then like the other people who were in the after school program, I noticed were more people of color, more Black people. A lot of like the white kids that I see or like the smart kids I see in my class like don't attend after school program.
There would always be problem children. The teachers would choose like the problematic kids in class. And it wasn't always someone who wasn't white, but most of the time it was. And I feel like the teacher would kind of single out that one person. And when the whole class was making commotion, they'd like single them out and say, you need to stop when it was really everyone doing it.
Like a lot of students I saw acting up or having experiences where they were not necessarily following the rules of the classroom and stuff. A lot of the times the student was kind of disregarded and not necessarily focused on. It not necessarily like they were like neglecting the students, just was like, let's not give attention to this behavior. So it kind of makes them feel like this behavior is not acceptable and we're not going to give attention to it.
There were more Black students who I would say were disciplined more or were more quickly disciplined than their white classmates. A lot of students were very quick to be disciplined in a way that I did not feel then or now was very effective or fair to those students.
I don't remember being in the principal's office and seeing many white kids. Now, maybe the timing was off. I'm sure plenty of white kids got sent to the principal's office. It's not like they couldn't be a disruption as well.
I tell you right now, Maplewood Middle is anybody who went to Maplewood Middle would tell you that was an experience like a lifetime. Like, I'll never forget everything that happened there.
I remember I had a friend who I made in middle school from a different elementary school, and she had never been to like my side of Maplewood and had never been in like a house, my kind of house, I guess. And I realized that only when I went to her house, which was like massive. And it was just a big shock, I guess, to me.
One of my first experiences at Maplewood Middle School was learning from students from other elementary schools that there were areas of Maplewood that were considered Maple Good, Maplewood, and Maplehood.
I remember in 8th grade, someone taught me like Maplewood, Maplehood, and Maple Good.
And going around the room or around the lunch table and discussing who was from which area and what that meant.
And someone who taught me it was from the area of Maple Good, which is like past town where Jefferson is and those elementary schools, or South Mountain even, even though that's in South Orange, but like around there, Wyoming.
And hearing that so and so's parent wouldn't let them come to so and so's neighborhood because it was too dangerous, even though this is all Maplewood we're talking about.
And then I think that was just a big change for me. And it kind of made me realize how divided Maplewood was.
So, despite the fact that it was an increasingly diverse racial and socioeconomic student body, yeah, there was a significant change in the level of integration among students.
Springfield Ave and Valley separate the three areas. In middle school is predominantly when you become more aware of these things. We started to understand that concept really in like middle school. This is where like leveled classes come into play. And I think this is the area where you start to notice the difference.
In 6th, 7th grade, I was in, quote, lower level math classes that I would say were, there were more white students in these upper level, quote unquote, classes than in the lower level classes. And that was when I started to see the disparity there. There were a lot of students who, a lot of Black students who weren't in those upper level classes. And I attribute a lot of that to the fact that once we were put in these levels, it was harder to get out of those, to move up, right? So the diversity in terms of who we were actually sitting in class with started to change.
Because if you're in like a lower level class, what you would notice is that's where it becomes a predominantly more of a minority class. And it's like, so are we really gonna say that all these white kids are just smarter than the Black kids? It's like that would be pretty ridiculous.
I was in the higher level classes. My parents, like when they would go to parent teachers conferences, they would tell me like, yeah, we only saw like like one or two other black couples there.
Like you see it just based on like the name of the class. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, I'm in honors. You in regular. You know what I'm saying? Or I'm in like super honors class or like middle school. That's when you start to see the separation big time.
There's no way for students of different backgrounds to interact and get to know each other outside of that at 11 and 12 years old.
Unless at lunch or maybe even gym, I pretty much never saw anybody who wasn't in my class level. More often than not, I would be like one of the very few Black people in my classes or people of color in my classes. And so that was something I was more aware of going as I got older.
Oh, I'm in these classes and there are less and less less and less minorities in these classes. In like 6th grade, not as much, but 7th grade, 8th grade especially. It's like, okay, we're really trimming off a lot of the minorities here. This is interesting. This was some of the first times people called me like an Oreo or said I was like one of the good ones. I didn't display certain ideas of Blackness that a lot of my classmates had, I guess, been taught to believe. Because at first when people say things like that, you don't really know how to like interact with it. So you just sort of like laugh it off and keep it moving. But eventually it starts to like weasel its way into your mind and starts to affect the way that you think about yourself and how you feel about your ability to belong in any sort of space. Because if you're not even if what people perceive you to be is not what you perceive yourself to be, then how can I belong in any space?
It was kind of the same trend where students of color were being disciplined more than white students. And I don't remember too well, but I think that there were definitely like there was more animosity, I think, developing between students and administrators, I think because of that issue.
There was more enforcement, I should say. Especially the older we got, like towards like eighth grade, like there was definitely more fights that occurred or just danger or stupid, behavioral issues that people had. So I definitely remember like people getting suspended for sure. And detentions, yeah, detentions were like a thing. I do remember like they were like call my mom sometimes or like my dad for some stupid things. Even more diversity, even, more disparity.
There was I think, even more of a drastic shift in what classrooms looked like as we got into Columbia High School. And I was in high school during all of the debates about leveling and de-leveling and all of that, and being able to opt in to whatever level. I don't think opting in undid the years of students being told that they were not qualified enough for a higher level course and not being given the proper education to get them into a higher level course.
It was my junior year when I had a AP computer science class, and I was one of three Black people in the class. So, and it was like a class of like 30 or something like that. And that was pretty significant. The TA was Black as well, so that was some sort of representation, but I also really did not interact with anybody except for those other two Black people.
Some kids, they knew that from when they first came into high school. They knew the whole plan, like how to get to college, and like I didn't know at all. There was some people they knew, like I gotta get into AP classes, you know? But I didn't have that like mentorship on my like personal side. Nobody was really telling me. I was just being told like you should just go to college. That's it. There was no like how or like, but
There were many instances where the few students of color who um, were in those AP higher level courses were singled out or mocked or embarrassed for simply being there in the classrooms that they deserved to be in. So
I was an A student and I was in every extracurricular activity. I worked really hard, and I remember my guidance counselor saying that the school that I wanted to go to was a reach, even though I knew it was very much within my grasp. And the school I wanted to go to was the University of Maryland, and I went there. I got there, no wait list, nothing like that. I got into that school, and I remember that experience being like kind of him saying that like I probably couldn't get into Maryland was like I thought that was a little racially charged.
Like the diversity of like orchestra, it was constant throughout my time in school, and which was so awesome. And I think that and even by the way, when we moved to like when I started doing chamber orchestra, for example, which I think, if I recall, you maybe had to audition for, I forget. But I remember thinking, well, there's still a lot of diversity, racial diversity, socioeconomic diversity in our chamber orchestra, which you can't necessarily say for like moving from like one version of math to another. But with orchestra, it kind of was very much the same, which was great.
Fencing was so diverse, so diverse. We had so many different racial backgrounds from Colombia representing our team. You have Asian, Indian, black, white. Everyone showed up and was a part of the team, and it was like a great family. So I think the sports that were attached to the school made racial in diversity, just much easier socially.
as we got older, the classes were more and more segregated, but the extracurriculars I was participating in were increasingly diverse. I was in the special dance company for all 3 eligible years of my high school experience, and that was a community that truly represented everyone in the school. And it was, you were spending a lot of time together, and so those people were your friends and your family and sort of your whole life for those 3 years. But to go from 2 periods of your day in that classroom to then going to an honors or an AP class and having it be the most homogenous room in the school was a very stark difference in the span of 7 minutes.
Help anybody who asks for your help, even if you don't identify with them. You may find there's some kind of commonalities there, but it's important to be open-minded and be encouraging to any and all students, because the purpose of students being in school is for them to learn.
It shouldn't be the parents reaching out to the school. It needs to be more of the school reaching out on behalf of the student.
The parents in particular are kind of just thinking that everything's okay and there's no problems in the school, and that we should champion that we're such a liberal, left-leaning, equal town, but that they don't understand that there's still so many problems going on. And you can't just ignore these problems by putting the band-aid term that we're equal and we're left-leaning and we're liberal and that everything's going to be okay.
School is just a symptom of, our real world issues. And so trying to fix like the diversity of like the school, like, yeah, that's not really going to happen if like the housing market is like through the roof and people who can't afford to live in that school district like don't live there.
I'm telling you right now, it's probably some people that's like, there ain't no people in Maplewood, South Orange that don't got no money or on government assistance, or it's probably some people that think that, and like you would think that, but if you've seen the paperwork or you've seen the school records and this and that, like, yeah, your mind would change instantly.
There is a certain level of grace, I think, that also needs to be had.
I think I've obviously spent a lot of time studying education now, doing my master's in it, and I've spent time in elementary school level classrooms as a teacher or as an assistant teacher. To have students learn with the people next to them is to have them grow with the people next to them, giving them an opportunity to truly just be in a classroom of their peers from whatever walk of life and whatever area of our two towns they're from, I think is one of the first steps.
Maplewood and South Orange are like very fascinating towns because they exist in a bubble. They exist sort of like separate from the real world in some ways. Nobody's immune to being prejudiced, especially when you live in a town in townships like those areas, because things move silently. They're quiet.
These are hard conversations and they're worth having. Children deserve to have a community that's willing to have those conversations and willing to embrace challenging each other to create a better education system for all students.
Thank you all, and I know it's getting late, but I just want to take a moment to thank Maplewood South Orange for being in this journey, right? For being on this journey of this work. And I think we just heard from the young alums how challenging the work is. And I just want to congratulate you all, because there's a lot of places that are doing this work right now, and I think it's so critical to our multiracial, multicultural society. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm a researcher. I was at Columbia University Teachers College for many years in the sociology and education program. I am a sociologist by training, but I've done a ton of work. I've done work on tracking and leveling that the former students were talking about back when I was in California. Some of the same issues that the alums were talking about were issues we were researching in the 1990s. So these are perennial issues, and I just want to thank you for being here tonight and for doing this hard work. So I'm just going to what I'm going to do here is give us a little bit of context about where we are as a society, and that seems to be rapidly changing these days, but just to kind of step back and put Maplewood South Orange in a larger context. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know from the research about how difficult this work is, and as it relates to that context, and then I'm going to talk about the benefits of doing this work of integration. So I'm sure you all know this, that in our current context, the word minority students constitutes the majority of students. So we have, since 2014, become a minority of white, non-Hispanic students in our public schools across the country. So this is due to changing birth rates, to immigration up until recently, but we're seeing demographic changes in our society, and we're also seeing, I think, personally, we're living in the middle of a backlash related to that. And so this is why the work that you're doing is so important, because what does a multiracial, multicultural democracy look like? And if we can't figure that out in our public schools, we're never going to figure it out anywhere else. So one thing to think about is the millennial parents. I've been doing a lot of research on millennials and Gen Zs, and this is where I'm getting my hope every day, is that we think about just the changing demographics, and it's not just our student population, it's also our parent population. With those changes, we're seeing changing attitudes, racial attitudes, and more just focus on social justice issues, more acceptance of multiracial marriages, more acceptance, more focus on inequality and social issues in general, and more support for living in diverse communities. And you see that now in Gen Z and the data on Gen Z as well. I'm the parent of a Gen Zer, and so you really see this just generational change in racial attitudes and understandings of our society. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about doing this work moving forward. We've also seen huge changes in racial attitudes and more growing acceptance of the idea of living in racially diverse communities, sending children to racially diverse schools. We have children who, adults now, parents who've been through racial integration themselves. And just the attitudes are changing. And I think part of what we're seeing in our politics today is an effort to move us backwards. So I think it's important to put this work in context, right? So we find that, again, just massive changes in terms of attitudes about racial diversity and integration. Recent survey found that 71% of all respondents felt that increasing diversity and integration in public schools is important for their improvement. So I think some recognition of changing attitudes is important. That doesn't mean that people are always going to make the right decisions when it comes to choosing schools and thinking about leveling and tracking within schools. The other thing to just think about, this is the work we've been doing and the research we've been doing on Long Island, in Westchester County, and in gentrifying areas of New York City, is that we're seeing changing demographics in different places, right? So we're seeing increasing Black, Latino, and Asian families moving into suburbs. Suburbs are becoming more diverse overall, and we're seeing gentrification in the city. So some people talk about this as metro migration patterns, which are creating a lot of opportunities for more racially diverse communities in both urban and suburban contexts. But we're also seeing in the research that these communities can be very unstable, right? And that integration is difficult work. And so I just want to applaud the work of the coalition to keep reminding us that this is not easy, and that if you don't do this work, you're going to see demographic changes happening very quickly. You're going to see ongoing white flight from certain communities and a withdrawal of resources from communities. So keeping schools and communities diverse is difficult but important work in the larger changing demographics. So this is what the research is showing, that where there's not intentional work being done in these changing suburban areas and urban areas, the process of resegregation will repeat itself in our diverse society. And I just want to point out that we're seeing this backlash happening, right? And we're seeing resistance to diversity, resistance to integration. It's a global phenomenon right now, as we're seeing a lot of migration patterns happening, not just in the US, but also in European countries. There's really important work being done on the resurgence of white supremacy groups globally. And nationalist parties, right, have been on the rise in Europe as well as in the US. Perceiving this national threat to the national identity of these countries. So what's important about that is that when we see the rise in this kind of polarizing, divisive politics, we also see a decrease in support for public institutions and for government programs, right? Sounds familiar? And so in the US, what that often is focused on is a decline in support for public education. Because honestly, we don't have as many social welfare policies in the US as other European countries do. But what we have put a lot of resources into is our public schools historically. So we have to be really thoughtful in this moment about what's happening in this country and how that could affect our greatest resource, which is our public education within our local communities. So one of the areas that I've done a lot of work in thinking about what does this look like in terms of at the school level, at the community level, is I've been thinking, we've been doing research on this kind of post-civil rights belief in diversity and integration as a good thing. And this is most likely, the more educated someone is, the more likely they are to say these things. But then there's also fears that we've heard about in the video that Rena talked about, and resistance. So racially diverse schools, there's fears that they're lower quality, lower status institutions than predominantly white schools. The social networks of highly educated parents cause insecurity about diversity. We've seen that in our research in New York City and gentrifying neighborhoods. And so sometimes that leads to choosing segregation over integration or lobbying for separate and unequal classes within racially diverse schools. So we have to really think about where we are as a society right now in this kind of larger context that I just went through very quickly, and to think about the work that you're doing here in Maplewood, South Orange. Because there's a real irony that where we are right now is that the greater level of education of most white parents, the more likely they are to support the idea of diversity and integration, and then the more likely they are to make choices that work against that. So that's something very paradoxical that comes up in the research, and I think it's important to name that and to recognize that that's a phenomenon that we're dealing with. The other thing that we need to think about is how the policy context that we're living in works against diversity. And that's measuring students primarily by standardized test scores, which only narrowly define ability and merit. Children are reduced to test scores that correlate with the education of their mothers. The single highest predictor of a child's test scores is the education level of their mother. That's something that's been true throughout history in terms of looking at test scores and different variables in children's families. But children are much more than test scores. And I think some of the strategies that Rena talked about are really, really important to remember in broadening our understanding of students' abilities and possibilities. So I just want to give you a quick vignette that relates to this context in New York City. My son attended a very racially diverse elementary school, very progressive, didn't focus a lot on test scores. He did have high test scores. Then when it came time for middle school, a lot of his friends, his white friends, were going to the school that you had to test to get into. And my son didn't like that school. We actually went on a tour and he didn't like it. So we went to the progressive middle school that was very diverse and didn't require test scores to get in. And I remember one of the parents of one of the white students that my son was friends with said to me, "Why isn't Trevor," that's my son, "going to X school, the school with the high test scores?" And she goes, "I thought he had really high test scores," right? So she was questioning my decision as a parent to not put my child in a school with high test scores. And I said, my son is actually very good at taking standardized tests, but where he needs support is in his social and emotional development. Where he needs support is in developing socially to get along with a lot of other students and to, really feel comfortable in who he is. And so knowing that as a parent, I think is really, really important, and what kind of leads us into thinking about the benefits of diverse schools and communities for our kids and thinking about our own children well beyond the test scores. Because too often, I've interviewed too many parents who think of their own status and value as a parent as tied to the test scores or achievement of their students, measured in very narrow ways. So we have to really think about what is our own role too as parents in perpetuating segregation. So for those of us who believe in the promise of public education in an increasingly diverse democracy, if we believe in the power of integration and the importance of it for our own children, as I know a lot of us do and would say so in a survey data that would come in, a survey that would come to us, then we need to really lean into what does the research tell us about why that is important for our children today. So there's a lot of research that suggests that sending children to racially, ethnically, and culturally homogeneous schools or segregated schools is not the best strategy for children for our current society and for the global society they will enter. So despite some of the changes we've seen around colleges and universities over the last 10 months, it is still true that colleges want high school graduates who can work and learn in culturally diverse settings. Universities have defended affirmative action on the basis of the educational benefits of diversity and the wide body of research that's available around students who go to more diverse schools, schools that are working on the leveling and tracking issues and trying to bring students together in classrooms. Employers, I've worked on many amicus briefs for court cases on affirmative action as well as on K through 12 diversity, and you'll always see the Chamber of Commerce show up because they want their employees, they want to hire workers who can work cooperatively and with diverse colleagues, who can cross cultural boundaries, who can learn from people with different backgrounds and experiences, some of the things that were in the video from the alums. So traditionally, corporations and employers have shown up to support that when it's gone to court. So I think that's important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about educational benefits of diverse schools and classrooms from thinking about, as a parent, thinking about students and what comes from that for them. So there's the student level in terms of enhanced learning and social and emotional development. We are going through kind of this critical point in the research of understanding neuroscience, understanding how children's brains develop, and understanding cognitive development and learning. And one of the things that we're seeing is that when children are exposed to difference, when their assumptions and their beliefs are challenged, it actually enhances their cognitive development and learning. So attending diverse K-12 schools and colleges is associated with improved critical thinking skills and capacity to consider alternative perspectives. And that negative diverse experiences, like some of the ones that were discussed in the interview, can reduce their engagement in school. So this part about what happens within schools and how we shape students' experiences is really important, but there is so much to be gained cognitively, socially, and emotionally from being in diverse schools. Research also shows us that diverse schools promote students' social and emotional well-being in school, improving feelings of safety, reducing isolation, and reducing depression. At the post-secondary level in colleges, the research shows students of all racial groups who engage in cross-racial interactions and friendships report more growth, college satisfaction, feelings of connectedness, self-efficacy, and more positive perceptions of institutional racial climate. So diverse schools have been shown to foster positive social skills and peer relations, which have important benefits for students' mental and academic well-being. Diverse classrooms also protect students against negative social experiences with peers and reduce negative effects of personally experienced discrimination. Diverse schools provide opportunities for interracial contact, which results in improved racial attitudes and comfort with diverse peers. Still, this doesn't come naturally. It's a lot of work that has to happen at the school level, of the kind of culture responsive practice that Rena was talking about, kind of anti-racist discipline policies. So diverse schools do not always lead to positive experiences, particularly for students of color, who while often reporting social and academic benefits, also report that they face racism and discrimination within racially diverse schools. So it's not just that diversity is not enough, it's also the conditions of diversity. But I think it's important too to realize that you can't work on those conditions and you can't develop those situations unless you have racially diverse schools and classrooms. Then there's a lot of research on the democratic outcomes and cross-racial understanding, so kind of the benefit for our society of educating students in diverse contexts. Students who attend diverse schools are in general more likely to report having experienced opportunities for civic learning and more likely to express a desire to become socially active as adults and also in higher education, and to be more civically engaged and to participate in democracy. Enhancing democratic engagement requires attention to curriculum and pedagogical strategies as well in higher education as well as K through 12. But again, the potential to create students who are more civically engaged and more committed to democracy in a multiracial and multicultural context comes through school diversity. So we have to think about what are some of the recommendations we need for supporting and sustaining successfully racially diverse schools. So we need to think, obviously, as you all have been doing here, about changing policies related to student assignment and access, and also incentives for states and districts and schools to support this work at the local level, which New Jersey has done, at least you have in your constitution, which is incredibly unique, that schools should be integrated and not segregated. But also we can't forget the second level is just as important, changing curriculum and pedagogy and school and classroom level practice and sociocultural issues. So being very attuned to culturally sustaining, culture responsive practices for students to acknowledge. I now work at Bank Street. Bank Street, anyone know Bank Street? A child-centered progressive education begins with the experiences and the understandings of students. So this history that we have in the New York metro area of really powerful progressive education that honors students and what they bring to school with them and creates a classroom climate where students are learning from each other. And really beginning with what the student understands through their own life experiences and their own family experiences. I just finished a project, an NSF project. Luckily, I finished it before NSF withdrew all its funding, but called STEM Stories, where students talked about STEM in their communities and their homes, and we worked with very racially diverse schools in New York City. And some of the children were asked as part of this project to go home, talk to their parents, talk to their caregivers about STEM in their parents' lives. And there was one student at one of the schools we were working with whose father worked for DoorDash. And she told the teacher, she said, my father doesn't know anything about STEM or science or math. And the teacher started asking her questions. She goes, well, how does he know where to take the food? How does he know how to calculate how much money he should be paid for and his tips and how much money he's made? How does he keep the food warm? So she went home and started asking her father all these questions about his job. And the next thing you know, she says, can my dad come in and talk about his work to the classroom? Because he has a lot of science and math in what he does every day. So there are ways that you can connect curriculum to students' own experiences, have them learn from each other, have them really value what they can learn from their families and their communities and bring that into the classroom, and that's a really important part of this work. So solutions, I think, is really about broadening what good schools are and changing policies, practices, and discourse. It's important that we redefine good schools, not only measuring schools by test scores, really broadening that definition. Think about good schools as being community-centered, caring for everyone, grounded in relationships. One of the things we know from research is what's most important in child development is relationships with their educators, relationships with other children in their classrooms. So if we really focus on that, how do we develop that? How do we foster that? Kids are going to be able to learn so much more and so much more quickly. They're going to feel the comfort in that space and a learning community. Educating the whole child that promotes the development of each child's best self. So again, beyond the kids with high test scores, really expanding what we think about is merit, what we think about as intelligence. This is the work of detracking and leveling that has been that way for 30 years. I've seen teachers who've done it really, really well and taught in detrack classrooms with kids who have very different test scores and really tapping into that diversity to support all children to learn. But I think the point that was raised by Alex in the video, that schools are a microcosm of a larger society and schools can't do that alone. And so we really need to focus on redefining accountability, redefining what good schools are, really helping K-12 policymakers. I work a lot with New York State Department of Education, really thinking through and building on arguments put forth around educational benefits of diversity, de-emphasizing test scores. I'm very proud of New York State. We're rolling out a new portrait of a graduate to replace our Regents exam, so stay tuned. That's going to be a lot of work in the next few years, but it is a way of really decentering only standardized test scores as ways to measure intelligence and ability and talent in students. And I think we really, when you think about it, children's success as adults is not going to be measured by test scores, right? So we really need to broaden the way we think about learning and achievement and merit within our schools. And changing the paradigm to embrace the new public for public education. So I think that's an important dialogue. I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation with you all tonight. And I know I went through quickly because I know we're all getting tired, but I hope that was helpful, and you can on my slides. So thank you.
And I'll pose this question to both of you. Just what advice would you give to young families on how they can support their district in making sure diversity is more than just demographics, so that it actually enhances learning and the experience for their children?
So I think I kind of covered this in my talk, but from the parent perspective, we need to think about what you can do to help support your school be successful. Show up as a support, as a resource, not sort of demanding things, but how can I help you with that? Or I noticed that you don't have a lot of books about LGBTQ families. Would you be open to me providing some resources? You know, we have this organization, this anti-racist equity team, so we do a lot of work through that. So it's hard as a new parent, like figuring out the school and the community and who are the folks. And so I would say, first of all, like ask all the questions. If you can tour schools, tour the schools, keep an open mind. And the other thing is that my mom used to say, like, schools don't need to do everything for your kid either, right? So, you know, don't expect the schools to just do everything for you either. But try to get involved, figure out how to get involved, and find your people.
Yeah, is this on? Is it working? Okay. I just want to underscore Rena's point about visiting the schools. So in one of the gentrifying areas of New York where we were doing research in the city in Brooklyn, the very affluent mostly white parents had been reassigned to a school that had been predominantly Black and Latinx, and it was near a housing project. It was an incredible school. I had done a lot of work there. It had a really strong early childhood program. It had lower test scores than the school up on the hill that they thought they were going to get to send their kids to when they built the condominiums there. So I went to a parent meeting in this affluent community and I started talking about the school, and I got shouted down by some angry Wall Street person saying that school's terrible, that school's terrible. We were sitting a stone's throw away from the school, and I said to him, I said, have you been to the school? And he said no. And I said, well, I don't think you should be judging it unless you walk through the doors of the school. And go spend some time in the pre-K classroom and see this amazing teacher. And I said her name, and I said, look at the community she's building. Maybe you still don't want to send your children there, and that's your decision, but I don't think you should be defining a school sitting here in this neighborhood when you have not even stepped foot into the building. Okay, so I just don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fair. You wouldn't do that if you're buying a car. You wouldn't want to go drive the car probably, unless you get it offline, online, now, but whatever. But I'm just saying, like, you really need to go visit the school and see what the climate is and the culture in the classrooms, and what are the relationships between the students and the educators and among the students themselves. And is it a culture of care and respect? Are there strong relationships there? These are things you should also be looking at. You know, I understand people are going to look at test scores, but you should really, really look at so much more than that.
Can I just add, talk to real people and not rely on Facebook.
Yes. Playground.
Okay, so for Ms. Jasey-Goodman, just in terms of, as a teacher, as your practice evolved, as you were going through the process of creating the culture and using the strategies that would support an inclusive education experience for students, what were the main factors that impacted or supported you being able to do that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I learned so much from Marilyn Davenport, as I said. You know, she would just kind of quietly come into my classroom and just start talking to the children and modeling for me what I should be doing. And then I tried out those same strategies. And so that was really helpful because that helped me figure out how to manage the students I was working with. When I student taught at PS 87, and my cooperating teacher had gone to Bank Street. And so I learned a lot from her about really great engaging practices. So I was really thankful for that. And I also taught at the Brooklyn School for Children, which is an all-inclusive school. So it's the whole school is inclusion. And so I learned a lot about how to differentiate and meet the needs of different types of learners in one classroom. And so those two experiences really helped prepare me. I also relied heavily on my child psych degree from college and understanding sort of how kids' brains work and how their emotional outbursts, what that meant, and seeing behavior as communication. And so I relied on a lot of those things, but most of all, I really strive to see all of my students as children first, and what were their strengths, and build those relationships with them. I had kids who cried for hours a day, and by the end, they were happy and they were engaged. And so I put the work in to really get to know what each kid needed.
Okay, and Dr. Stuart Wells, so along the same lines, we have an educator who is exhibiting these practices, or a school that's doing that as well. For the young parents and families, if you give us like a quick list of, I guess, look-fors or metrics that they can keep in mind when they're trying to evaluate whether integration efforts are effective, are genuine, are really helping our students.
Sure. So like when they go visit the school, yeah. I would look for happy children. I would look for joy. I would look for engagement, joy in learning, a sense of community in a classroom and in a larger school community. And really, so much of it is students being tapping into that curiosity that they all bring with them to school, and that will be expressed in joy. And I think also there's a lot of work that teachers do, good teachers do, to create that sense of care and community and curiosity about each other within a classroom, right? So that's really when you know integration's working. Also teachers who, because they're culture responsive, recognize that students are going to show their talents and their intellect in different ways, and it's like a tapestry, right? Finding the ways to weave that together to help tap into all the different strengths that the students are bringing into your classroom to create something really beautiful together in a cooperative way. So we know from back when we first started doing school desegregation, there was cooperative learning where kids were actually learning together with each other. And it was really, really powerful work. And you'll see that today in good classrooms where teachers really understand how to connect with all students and engage and bring out the joy in each of them.
Okay, thank you. We do have some questions from the audience. Let's see, so this will go to Rena. What resistance did you encounter early on from some veteran teachers? Mm-hmm. How did you overcome it, and how long did it take?
So I want to start by saying that I was extremely lucky to have my first teaching job be at Seth Boyden, where the whole vibe of the school, the whole culture of the school was child-centered. So, I talked to my student teachers about getting caught in the undertow of a school environment as a new teacher. This was a very positive undertow to be caught up in. Everybody was sort of on the same page. We were all working hard to provide engaging activities for our kids. There were some teachers who were not as on board, one example of that was one example was when I was talking about the after-school enrichment program that I created to help improve access to the gifted programs. That actually the head of the union came in and had some very strong words for me about how I should not be giving free labor after school without getting paid. And what if my students did better on the test as a result of the work I was doing? I was like, that's kind of the point. So I was like, how about this is a pilot? So the way I responded was I focused it on me. I was like, listen, I'm a new teacher. I'm overwhelmed. I'm stressed. I'm here anyway, working late. Like, if I can work with my students and review the material, because at the time the test was in March, so I had to get through the whole curriculum by March. So I didn't have time to do reviewing during the day and getting new material. And so I sort of came at it from that lens. And then I also said, okay, so your issue is that I'm not getting paid. Yes. So what if I were to find a way to pay myself? That would be fine. And so then that's when I wrote a grant, got funding, started a whole program for the entire school. And so I appreciate the union and I appreciate the work that they do, and it's highly important, and I don't want to put anybody in a situation where they feel compromised. And so, it's a negotiation, it's a give and take, and so I try to be respectful of where people are coming from, and also trying to sort of model child-centered approaches too.
And I don't know, Dr. Stuart Wells, did you want to respond to that? I know that in terms of resistance, in your work you look at societal forces and things of that nature, or even things in terms of policy. Did you want to respond to that in terms of resistance and how young families can help in overcoming that type of resistance, or supporting a school district in overcoming that resistance?
Right. I think it goes back to the work I did on racially diverse schools that were tracked and the efforts to detrack. These were secondary schools. And when you find those teachers who understand that work and are good at it, they're often swimming upstream within their schools. And so I was always inspired by those teachers who understood that work and who then tried to connect with parent groups or activists in the community to support them in that work and to start to build coalitions. Strategic alliances is a word that I often think about when we're trying to do difficult school reform. We're trying to like dismantle structures that have been in place for so long and exist within policies that support those structures, right? And then how those structures have become so racialized over time, as the alums talked about in the video. So, I think that we need strategic alliances. When you see the power of a teacher who's really good at doing this work, who's taking kids from all different levels in a school and teaching English to all of them and having them all achieve to their highest potential, it's a very special educator who can do that within a system that pushes against that. And so support for those kinds of educators is really important, and building some alliances within the schools and the communities, I think, is really, really important. It can be done, it has been done, and it's a beautiful thing when it happens, so.
Okay, we have another question. I'll read it as it's written. It says, if black families chose self-Boyden, so their children would be with other black children, do black children lose something in integrated classrooms? And I'll add, is there something lost, by students who are being put into integrated classrooms? So black students in particular, but we can expand that as well.
I think a lot depends on that context, right? And depends on that kind of community that's being created. But definitely there is a lot of evidence in the research that if educators are not paying attention to all the things that Rena talked about, that I talked about, your example from middle school with your teacher in your country of origin, I mean, that was just a great example of the kind of harms that are done to students of color often in schools. So if the context is one where the adults and the white students and white families aren't understanding kind of the benefits of diversity and what the assets and the strengths and the insights and the community resources and assets that students of color bring to school with them, then those kind of harms can be done. But I think that's something that we need to be working on as a community, because, and there are ways to work within those spaces to create affinity groups, to create safe spaces for students of color, create affinity groups for white students so that they can talk about kind of their own struggles in terms of dealing with racism that may be in their communities and in their families, and thinking about their role in this work. So there are things that can be done within diverse schools to create spaces for students to cope, but also the overall work of dismantling these racial hierarchies that are part of the society that we live in, right? So it's no wonder that they show up in our schools, but it's the really difficult work, and it's powerful work, and it's incredibly rewarding when it's done well.
So I wanted to just say that in this example with Seth Boyden, the Black families who were choosing to send their children there from more affluent parts of town, I think they were choosing to have a more affirming experience for their children at Seth Boyden, because it was a predominantly Black school, and so there was a lot of affirming of Black students, and I felt like it was a space that really treated Black children well. Generally, right? There were incidents where that wasn't true, but I think for these experiences, that's the case. One of the things that didn't make it to my talk, but was in my notes, was this idea of how are we making sure that integration is serving the needs of all students in that experience, right? And so in my experience at Boyden, I often had only 3 or 4 white students in my class. And so when we would make classes, we were very careful about how we made those classes. They were the minority, right? And so we wanted to make sure that students felt a sense of belonging and they had peers, etc. And now as a parent, when my child is the only Black girl in the class, and I'm like, there's a Black girl in that other class, why aren't they together? So we're not thinking about, are we thinking about integrating and having diversity for the white students, so that they can have one Black kid and one Asian kid and one Indian kid and one Latino kid? Or are we also thinking about the experience of that Black girl being the only Black girl when there's another Black girl in the other room? Like, can we put them in the same room? Even though that means that class may not have any Black children for the white kids to benefit from being with. So it is a very complicated question, and especially when our numbers are getting lower, like in Montclair, our students of color population is dwindling, as it is here, I think, because of the home crisis, etc. It is something to keep in mind, right? Like, we have to protect those children and make sure that the classrooms are spaces where they can feel belonging and have those windows and mirrors.
All right, and so those are all the questions I have for this evening. Again, we did receive more questions that we will get to in terms of bringing them back to the school committee and making sure that we have some responses for folks in the future. But again, I want to thank Dr. Stuart Wells and Ms. Marina Jasey-Goodman for your presentations and for being here for us tonight and providing us with some very, very critical insight and information towards this effort. So thank you.